Commander Jessica Hayes sat in her command chair aboard the UES, resolute, and watched the stars streak past the viewing window like silver threads against black cloth, and she felt the familiar hum of the ship engines beneath her boots, and it was a sound that had become like her own heartbeat after 15 years of service in the United Earth Space Navy, and today was supposed to be a routine patrol along the Outer Rim territories. But the universe had other plans, as it often did when humans were involved. The bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency around her and Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez sat at the navigation console with her fingers dancing across the holographic displays, and Ensign Kate Morrison monitored communications while Technical Officer Linda Chen kept watch over the weapons systems. And they were a good crew, and Jessica trusted them with her life, as she had done many times before in situations far worse than a simple patrol mission. Then the alarm sounded, and it cut through the quiet efficiency of the bridge like a knife, and every head turned toward the communications station, where Kate was already working to isolate the signal, and her face had gone pale in the blue glow of her screens, and Jessica felt her stomach tighten because she knew that look, and it was never good news. Kate looked up, and her voice was steady.
Ow.
Despite the tension in her shoulders, and she said that they were receiving a distress beacon on an open emergency channel. And it was coming from approximately 14 minutes away at maximum speed, and the signal was weak. But the automated translation matrix was working to decode the alien language patterns, and Jessica leaned forward in her chair and told Kate to put it through the main speakers. The bridge filled with a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying, and it was like wind chimes, mixed with crystal bells, but underneath it was raw panic and fear, and the translation came through in fragments at first, and then more clearly as the computer locked onto the language patterns, and the voice was female and desperate. And she was saying that their ship was under attack and shields were failing, and they needed immediate assistance, and their coordinates followed, and then the message repeated. Yami had already pulled up the star charts, and her face was grim as she reported that the coordinates were deep in contested space, and it was an area where the Dominion had been making aggressive moves for the past 6 months, and any human ship entering that sector would be seen as a provocation and possibly an act of war, and the Esprit Dominion was not known for their patience or their mercy. Jessica stood from her chair and walked to the main tactical display, and she could see the small blinking icon that represented the distressed ship, and around it were 6 larger icons that were almost certainly Dominion cruisers, and the odds were not good, and any reasonable commander would report this up the chain of command and wait for orders and let the diplomats figure out what to do. But Jessica had not joined the Space Navy to be reasonable, and she had not survived the frontier wars by playing it safe. She turned to Amy and asked how fast they could reach those coordinates, and Amy ran the calculations quickly and said 14 minutes if they pushed the fusion drives past safety limits and possibly caused permanent damage to the engine systems, and there was also a 70% chance the Dominion fleet would detect their approach and open fire immediately. And Jessica nodded slowly and looked around at her crew, and she could see the same thought in all their eyes, because they were human, and humans did not abandon people in need. The decision was easy, even if the consequences were not, and Jessica gave the order to set an intercept course and divert all available power to the engines, and she told Linda to begin weapons prep and to load the railguns with armor-piercing rounds and ready the missile pods, and Kate should try to raise Earth command and inform them of the situation, but not to wait for a response, because they would be too far away for real-time communication by the time any orders came through. Resolute lurched forward, and the acceleration pressed everyone back into their seats, and the inertial dampeners whined as they struggled to compensate for the massive forces involved, and the ship was designed to handle this kind of stress, because human engineers understood something that most alien species did not, and that was that humans could survive acceleration that would turn other species into paste, and they had built their ships accordingly. Amy counted down the minutes as they raced toward the coordinates, and Jessica used the time to study everything they knew about Dominion tactics and ships. And the Dominion were a reptilian species that valued strength above all else, and they had been expanding their territory aggressively for decades, and they saw the rest of the galaxy as either subjects or obstacles, and diplomacy was not their strong suit, the Elven Confederation on the other hand was almost the complete opposite, and they were an ancient race that had been traveling the stars for over 3,000 years, and they valued art and philosophy and peaceful coexistence in their ships. Were beautiful but lightly armed, and they had avoided major conflicts through clever diplomacy and strategic retreat, but it seemed their luck had finally run out. Jessica had met a few elves during her time at the academy, and they had been polite and refined, and almost ethereal in their movements, and they had looked at humans with a mixture of fascination and concern, because humans were young and violent and unpredictable, and they came from a world that the rest of the galaxy called a death world, and where everything from the weather to the wildlife tried to kill you on a daily basis, and humans had not only survived, but thrived. The tactical display updated as they got closer, and now they could see the full extent of the situation, and the elven ship was called the Star Whisper, according to its identification beacon, and it was venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, and its shields were at critical levels, and the 6 Dominion cruisers had formed a loose circle around it, and they were taking their time and savoring their victory like predators playing with wounded Priami. Announced 2 minutes to intercept, and Jessica ordered battle stations, and the bridge lights shifted to red, and klaxons sounded throughout the ship, and crew members secured themselves at their stations and sealed their emergency suits, and the Resolute transformed from a patrol vessel into a weapon, and every system was aligned toward one purpose, and that was to fight and survive and win. Jessica opened a ship-wide channel, and her voice carried to every deck and every compartment, and she told her crew that they were about to engage a superior force in defense of an allied vessel, and that the Dominion would not expect them, would not be prepared for human tactics, and she reminded them that they were the descendants of survivors, and that their ancestors had faced down everything from ice ages to asteroid strikes and come out stronger, and today they would show the galaxy what that meant. The crew responded with a cheer that echoed through the channel, and Jessica felt pride swell in her chest, because these were her people, and they understood what was at stake, and they were willing to risk everything for strangers, because that was what humans did, and it was both their greatest strength and their greatest weakness. Linda reported that all weapons were hot and ready, and the railguns were charged, and the missile pods were loaded, and targeting solutions were being calculated for all 6 Dominion ships, and Jessica told her to prioritize the flagship and focus on engines and propulsion systems because they wanted to disable, not destroy, if possible, and Linda confirmed the orders with a grim smile. Tate announced that she was receiving a response from the elven ship, and Jessica told her to open a channel, and the main screen flickered, and then filled with the image of an elven woman, and her features were delicate and perfect, like something from a painting in her silver hair floated around her face in the zero gravity of a damaged bridge, and behind her fires burned, and crew members rushed back and forth trying to contain the damage of the elven woman spoke, and her voice was like music, even through the static and fear, and she identified herself as a navigator, Lyra of the Star Whisper, and she asked if the approaching ship was friendly, and Jessica said yes and told her to prepare for immediate evacuation and that they would cover her escape, and Lyra looked confused and asked why humans would risk war with the Dominion for strangers, and Jessica just smiled and said it was what they did. Damie counted down the final seconds, and then they dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly between the Dominion fleet and the wounded Star Whisper, and the alien ships scattered in surprise because nobody expected interference, and certainly not from a single human vessel, and Jessica saw the moment of confusion on the Dominion flagship bridge through their view screen, and she used that moment to strike first. The Dominion flagship recovered quickly from its surprise and opened a communication channel, and the face that appeared on the screen was reptilian and covered in dark green scales, and the eyes were yellow and cold like a snake, and the creature wore what appeared to be military decorations across its chest, and its voice was harsh and grating when it spoke through the translation matrix. The Dominion commander demanded to know what the human ship was doing in contested space, and said that they had no jurisdiction here and should withdraw immediately or be destroyed in there. It was arrogance in every word, because the Dominion had 6 ships and the humans only had 1. And mathematics was simple even for primitive species like humans. Jessica stood and walked closer to the view screen, and her face was calm, but her eyes were hard, and she told the Dominion commander that the Star Whisper had broadcast a distress call on an open channel, and that humans were responding, as was their obligation under galactic law, and that the Dominion could leave peacefully, or they could stay and learn why nobody attacked human allies, the Dominion. The commander laughed, and it was an ugly sound, and he said that humans were young and foolish and knew nothing of real power, and that one ship could not stand against 6, and that this would be a valuable lesson for Earth about staying out of affairs that did not concern them. And Jessica just smiled and said that his mathematics were about to get corrected. She cut the channel and turned to Linda and gave the order to fire, and the Resolute shuddered as its railguns erupted and magnetic accelerators hurled tungsten slugs at a significant fraction of light speed, and the projectiles crossed the distance in heartbeats and slammed into the Dominion flagship engine section with devastating accuracy. The alien ship rocked from the impact, and secondary explosions rippled through its aft section, and its engines flickered and died, and the massive vessel began to list to one side, and sparks flew from damaged systems, and the other Dominion ships hesitated for just a moment because they had not expected such immediate and overwhelming violence. That moment of hesitation was all Jessica needed, and she ordered Evasive Pattern, Delta, and Amy through the Resolute into a spinning dive that would have killed any crew without proper inertial dampening, and the ship moved like a dancer, and plasma bolts from the Dominion cruisers streaked through empty space where the Resolute had been just seconds before. Linda fired again, and this time she targeted the engines of a second Dominion ship, and more tungsten rounds found their mark, and another enemy vessel went dark and began drifting, and now the odds were 4-1 instead of 6-1, and the Dominion were starting to realize that they had made a serious miscalculation. The remaining 4 Dominion ships opened fire with everything they had, and plasma bolts filled the space around the Resolute, and some of them connected, and the shields flared bright blue as they absorbed the energy, and Jessica watched the shield percentage drop from 100 to 90-80, and she knew they could not take this kind of punishment for long. Kate reported that the Star Whisper was launching escape pods, and that their crew was evacuating, and Jessica told Amy to position the Resolute between the pods, and the Dominion fleet and Amy did it without hesitation, and now the human ship was a shield for the escaping. And the Dominion realized this and increased their fire. Linda launched the first wave of missiles, and the pods deployed from the Resolute flanks, and dozens of warheads scattered across the battlefield, and half of them were decoys, loaded with sensor jammers and electronic warfare packages, and the Dominion could not tell which were real until the actual warheads began detonating against their shields. One Dominion ship took 3 direct hits, and its shields collapsed, and the hull breached in multiple places, and atmosphere vented in frozen clouds, and the ship went silent and dark and floated dead in space. And now the odds were 3-1, and the Dominion commander was screaming orders at his remaining ships. Jessica opened the channel to Lyra again, and the Elven navigator was watching the battle with wide violet eyes, and her expression was one of shock and disbelief. And she asked how one human ship was defeating a Dominion fleet, and Jessica said it was because humans came from a world where everything tried to kill them, and they had learned to hit first and hit hard and never give up. Lyra said that the Elven Confederation had debated for years about whether to ally with humanity, and that many considered humans too violent and too unpredictable and too dangerous. And Jessica said that was probably fair, but asked if Lyra would rather be dead and right, or alive and reconsidering her assumptions. And Lyra actually laughed. Despite the terror of the situation, the 3 remaining Dominion ships tried a new tactic and split up to attack from different angles, and Jessica ordered Amy to focus on the closest target and to ignore the others for now, and Amy drove the Resolute straight at one of the Dominion cruisers, and Linda fired both railguns and missiles simultaneously, and the combined firepower was more than the alien shields could handle. Dominion ship exploded in a ball of white fire, and debris scattered in all directions, and the Resolute flew through the expanding cloud and came out the other side with minor scoring on its hull. And now there were only 2 enemy ships left, and They were beginning to understand that they were not hunters, but Jessica could see the moment when the Dominion commander made his decision because his ship began charging. Its main weapon and energy readings spiked across all sensors, and Kate said it was some kind of massive plasma cannon, and if it fired at full power, it would cut through the Resolute shields like paper and probably destroy the ship in one shot. Problem for the Dominion was that charging such a weapon took time, and Jessica was not about to give them that time, and she ordered Amy to plot a collision course with the flagship, and Amy looked at her with surprise, but entered the coordinates without question, and the Resolute turned and accelerated directly toward the Dominion command ship. The alien commander face appeared on the screen again, and this time there was no arrogance and only fear, because he was watching a human ship charge straight at him without slowing down, and he was shouting orders and trying to divert power from the main weapon to engines, but it was too late. Jessica waited until they were close enough to see individual hull plates on the Dominion ship, and then she ordered full reverse thrust and all remaining missiles to launch at point-blank range, and the Resolute engines screamed as they fought against momentum, and dozens of warheads crossed the tiny distance in less than a second. Dominion flagship shields failed under the concentrated barrage, and the missiles punched through the hull and detonated inside, and the entire ship shuddered, and then the overloading main weapon fed back into its own power systems, and the flagship tore itself apart from within in a catastrophic explosion that lit up the entire sector. The last Dominion ship did not wait to see what happened next, and its engines flared bright, and it jumped to faster than light speed and fled the battlefield, and Jessica let it go because she wanted survivors to tell the story and to spread the word that humans protected their friends and allies. The bridge was silent for a moment as everyone processed what had just happened, and then Kate began getting damage reports, and the Resolute had taken hits, but nothing critical, and the shields were at 30% but regenerating, and the engines were strained but functional, and all crew members were accounted for. And Jessica sat back down in her command chair and felt the adrenaline slowly drain from her system, and her hands were shaking slightly, but she kept them steady on the armrests, and she opened the channel to the Star Whisper again and asked if all their crew had evacuated safely. Lyra confirmed that everyone was in escape pods and accounted for, and her ship was dying, but her people were alive, and she said that she did not understand why humans would do this and would risk war and death for strangers in South. Jessica thought about how to explain something that seemed so obvious to her. She said that humans came from a world that gave no mercy, and where cooperation meant survival, and where helping others was not weakness but strength, and that humans had learned long ago that you protect the pack, even if the pack includes people you just met. And Lyra was quiet for a long time. Then Lyra said that the Elven Confederation had been wrong about humanity, and that violence and compassion were not opposites, but could exist in the same heart, and that maybe the galaxy needed more species willing to stand up to bullies like the Dominion, and Jessica said that she hoped so because Earth could not fight every battle alone. Kate interrupted to say that she was picking up more ships on long-range sensors, and they were Elven vessels responding to the distress call, but they were still 20 minutes away, and Jessica told her to send them their status and coordinates and to let them know the situation was under control. The Resolute moved slowly through the debris field, collecting the Elven escape pods, and each one was brought carefully into the main hangar bay where medical teams waited to check the survivors for injuries. And Jessica watched the operation from the bridge and felt satisfaction that they had not lost a single Elven life, despite the overwhelming odds. Amy was already calculating a course to the nearest safe station, and it was an Elven outpost called Haven Point, about 6 hours away at cruising speed, and the Resolute could make the journey easily, even with its damaged shields and strained engines, and the Elven rescue ships could meet them there. Linda was running diagnostics on the weapons systems and reporting that they had expended 70% of their missiles and the railguns needed maintenance after firing so many rounds in rapid succession, but everything was still functional, and they could defend themselves if another threat appeared. And Jessica told her to keep monitoring the sensors. Kate was dealing with a flood of communications. An Earth command wanted a full report, and the Elven Confederation was sending thanks and questions, and even a few other species were reaching out to ask what had happened. And News of the battle was already spreading across the local networks, and Jessica knew this would have consequences far beyond. One rescue mission she stood and told Amy to take command of the bridge, and that she was going down to the hangar bay too. Meet their guests, and Amy nodded and settled into the command chair, and Jessica made her way through the corridors of her ship and crew members. She passed, looked tired but proud, and several saluted as she went by. The hangar bay was organized chaos. When she arrived and elven survivors were being helped out of their pods by human crew members, and the contrast between the two species was striking, and the elves were tall and slender with graceful movements and features that seemed almost too perfect, and the humans were shorter and stockier and moved with practical efficiency. Jessica spotted Lyra immediately because she was the one coordinating her people and making sure everyone was accounted for. And the elven navigator looked exhausted, and her silver hair was tangled and her uniform was torn and stained, but she held herself with dignity and grace. When Lyra saw Jessica, she walked over, and for a moment neither spoke, and then Lyra did something unexpected, and she bowed deeply in the formal elven manner and said that she owed Jessica and her crew a life debt, and that the Star Whisper crew would never forget what humans had done. Today, Jessica felt uncomfortable with such formal gratitude, and she said that they had only done what anyone should do and that no debt was owed, and Lyra smiled and said that was exactly what made humans so dangerous and so valuable, and that most species would calculate costs and benefits before acting, but humans just acted when someone needed help. Young elven male approached and spoke quietly to Lyra in their native language, and Lyra responded and then turned back to Jessica and explained that her engineer was asking about the resolute weapon systems because they had never seen such effective firepower from a ship this size, and Jessica said she would arrange a tour if they were interested. Elevon said that would be appreciated because the Elven Confederation needed to learn how to better defend themselves, and that they had relied too long on diplomacy and retreat, and the galaxy was becoming more dangerous, and species like the Dominion only respected strength. And Jessica agreed and said she would be happy to share tactical information. The medical officer approached and reported that all the elven survivors were checked and only minor injuries were found, and mostly bruises and some smoke inhalation, and everyone would recover fully, and Jessica felt relief because saving people only to have them die later would have been a terrible outcome. She asked Lyra if she needed anything, and Lyra said that her crew needed rest and food and time to process what had happened, and Jessica assigned quarters and said they would reach Haven Point in 6 hours, and Lyra could contact her people from there and arrange transportation home. Lyra thanked her again and gathered her crew, and they followed a human ensign toward the guest quarters, and Jessica watched them go and thought about how strange the galaxy was and how quickly things could change. And 6 hours ago, she had been on a routine patrol, and now Earth might be on the verge of war with the Dominion. She returned to the bridge, and Amy reported that they were on course for Haven Point, and sensors showed no hostile contacts, and Earth Command had acknowledged their report and said a full inquiry would be conducted when they returned home, and Jessica knew that meant she would be answering a lot of questions about her decision. 2. Engage Kate said that the Elven Confederation had sent an official message of thanks and requested a meeting with Jessica when they reached Haven Point, and apparently several high-ranking elves wanted to speak with her about what had happened, and possibly about future cooperation between their species. Linda reported that the shield generators were back to 60% and would be fully restored in another hour, and the engines were running smoothly despite the stress they had endured. And the Resolute was in good shape considering they had just fought 6 hostile ships, and Jessica felt pride in her vessel and crew. She sat in her command chair and pulled up the sensor logs from the battle and watched the engagement again from a tactical perspective, and she analyzed what had worked and what could be improved, and humans had an advantage because they thought about combat differently than most species. Races built ships for exploration or trade and added weapons as an afterthought, but humans built warships, and that was the difference in every system on the Resolute. It was designed to work together for maximum combat effectiveness, and the crew trained constantly for battle scenarios, and it showed in their performance. Jessica also knew that humans had another advantage, and that was their willingness to take risks that other species considered insane and charging. Directly at an enemy flagship, while it charged a main weapon, was not something most commanders would even consider, but Jessica had calculated the timing and knew they could launch missiles before the weapon fired. ISK and Reward and humans had survived on a death world by understanding both and by pushing boundaries and by refusing to accept defeat, and those traits had followed them to the stars and made them formidable. Despite being a young species with limited territory and resources, Amy interrupted her thoughts and said they were receiving a transmission from the Elven rescue fleet, and did she want to take it? And Jessica said yes, and the main screen filled with the image of an older Elven male wearing what appeared to be military uniform, and his expression was serious. He introduced himself as Admiral Talon of the Confederation Defense Fleet and said he was commanding the rescue ships heading to Haven Point, and he wanted to thank Jessica personally for saving the Star Whisper crew, and asked if the Resolute needed any assistance. Jessica said they were fine and on course for Haven Point and would arrive in about 5 hours, and all the survivors were safe and healthy. And Admiral Talon nodded and said that word of the battle had reached the Confederation High Council and they wanted to discuss potential military cooperation with Earth. She said she was just a ship captain, and such discussions should go through proper diplomatic channels, but Admiral Talon smiled and said that sometimes the best diplomacy came from warriors who understood each other, and that he hoped to speak with her at Haven Point. The transmission ended, and Amy looked at Jessica and said it seemed like they had just changed galactic politics with one battle, and Jessica said that was above their pay grade, but she hoped the diplomats and politicians would not mess it up. Kate laughed and said that was optimistic, and politicians always mess things up, but maybe this time the results would be worth it. And Linda added that the Dominion had been growing too aggressive and needed someone to stand up to them, and humans were apparently volunteering for that role. Jessica said they were volunteering to help friends and allies, and if that meant standing up to the Dominion, then so be it, and humans did not start fights, but they finished them, and the galaxy needed to understand that Earth would defend those who could not defend themselves. The next few hours passed quietly as the Resolute cruised toward Haven Point, and Jessica used the time to write her official report, and she tried to explain her decision to engage in clear tactical terms, but she knew that some people back on Earth would question why she had risked war over strangers. She included all relevant sensor data and communication logs and a detailed timeline of events, and she emphasized that the Star Whisper had broadcast on an open emergency channel, which by galactic law required any nearby vessel to render assistance, and she had followed protocol even if the location was problematic. Amy announced they were approaching Haven Point, and the station appeared on the view screen. And it was beautiful in the way that Elven constructions always were, and it looked more like art than architecture, with flowing curves and crystalline towers and soft lights that seemed to glow from within. Several Elven ships were already docked, and more were approaching, and Kate said the station was hailing them and offering priority docking, and Jessica accepted and guided the Resolute toward the assigned berth. The docking process was smooth, and the Resolute settled into its berth with gentle precision. And through the view screen, Jessica could see dozens of Elven officials and media personnel gathered at the docking port, and she realized this was going to be much bigger than a simple drop-off of survivors. She told Amy to oversee the transfer of their guests and to make sure that elves got whatever they needed, and then she went to her quarters to change into her dress uniform, because apparently she was about to represent humanity in front of the Elven Confederation, and she wanted to look professional. The dress uniform felt stiff after days in her regular duty clothes, but Jessica had worn it enough times to know how to move in it, and she checked her appearance in the mirror and made sure everything was regulation and proper, and then she made her way to the main airlock where Lyra was waiting with her. Crew Lyra had also changed and now wore formal Elven robes that shimmered like starlight in her silver hair had been brushed and arranged, and she looked every bit the dignified navigator she was. And when she saw Jessica, she smiled and said she hoped Jessica was ready for what came next. Jessica asked what that meant, and Lyra said that the Confederation rarely saw such direct action against the Dominion, and that the High Council wanted to understand human thinking and also wanted to discuss possible military alliances. And Jessica said she was a ship captain, not a diplomat, but she would do her best. Airlock opened, and they stepped out onto Haven Point Station. And immediately they were surrounded by elves and flashing lights from recording devices and questions being shouted in multiple languages, and Jessica felt overwhelmed, but kept her expression calm and professional. A path opened through the crowd. And Admiral Talon approached, with several other high-ranking elves, and he greeted Jessica formally and thanked her again for saving the Star Whisper crew, and then he turned to address the crowd and media and said that statements would be given at a proper press conference and everyone should return to their duties. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, and Admiral Talon guided Jessica and Lyra toward a quieter area of the station, and they entered what appeared to be a conference room with walls that showed holographic images of peaceful forests and flowing water, and soft music played in the background. Several elves were already seated at a long table, and they stood when Jessica entered, and Admiral Talon introduced them as members of the High Council and military advisors and diplomatic staff, and Jessica tried to remember all their names, but there were too many. The eldest elf gestured for everyone to sit, and Jessica took a seat across from the council members, and Lyra sat beside her, and Admiral Talon sat at the head of the table, and the room fell silent as everyone waited for someone to begin. Eldest elf spoke first, and his voice was soft, but carried authority, and he said that the Confederation had been aware of humanity for several years but had kept their distance, because humans seemed too aggressive and too unpredictable, and the Council had debated endlessly about whether contact was wise. But today had changed everything, and Jessica had demonstrated that human aggression could be directed at protecting others, and that human unpredictability meant they would act when others hesitated, and that these traits might be exactly what the galaxy needed right now. He asked Jessica to explain her thinking during the battle and why she had risked so much for people she did not know, and Jessica took a moment to organize her thoughts, and then she spoke plainly and honestly. She said that humans came from a difficult world where survival meant cooperation and helping others, and that her ancestors had learned long ago that a strong community was more important than individual safety, and that these values had followed humanity to the stars. She also said that the Dominion was a threat to everyone, and that allowing them to attack peaceful ships without consequence would only encourage more aggression, and that sometimes you had to stand up to bullies even if it was dangerous. Council members listened and nodded and asked questions about human tactics and training and ship design, and Jessica answered as best she could and explained that Earth built military vessels first and adapted them for other purposes rather than the other way around. One council member asked if humanity was seeking to expand its territory through military action, and Jessica said no, and that Earth wanted peaceful relations and trade but would defend itself and its allies and would not stand by while others were. Attacked Admiral Talon spoke up and said that the Confederation Defense Fleet had studied the sensor logs from the battle and were impressed by the resolute combat performance, and asked if Earth would be willing to share technology and training with Elven forests. Jessica said she could not make that decision, but that she would recommend it to her superiors, and that sharing knowledge would benefit both species and help create a safer galaxy. Another council member asked about human culture and society, and whether all humans were as willing to risk themselves for strangers, and Jessica smiled and said that humans were diverse, and not everyone would make the same choice, but that helping others was a core value for most humans. Lyra spoke up for the first time and said that she had seen human compassion alongside human violence, and that both were real and both came from the same source, and that the galaxy needed to understand that humans fought to protect, not to conquer. The eldest elf nodded slowly and said that the council would discuss everything that had been said and would send official communications to Earth government proposing formal alliance talks and military cooperation agreements and technology exchange programs. He also said that Lyra and her crew would receive commendations for their service, and that Haven Point would host a formal ceremony honoring both the Star Whisper survivors and the Resolute crew, and Jessica said she appreciated that, but her crew had only done their duty. The meeting continued for another hour with more questions and discussions about logistics and politics and potential timelines, and Jessica felt exhausted by the end. but also hopeful that something good might come from this. When the meeting finally ended, Admiral Talon offered to give Jessica a tour of Haven Point Station, and she accepted because she was curious about Elven technology and design, and also because she needed to move around after sitting for so long. The station was impressive, and everywhere Jessica looked, she saw evidence of advanced engineering combined with artistic beauty, and the elves did not separate function and aesthetics, but combined them seamlessly, and Admiral Talon explained that this was central to Elven philosophy. They passed gardens where plants grew in impossible arrangements that seemed to defy gravity, and observation decks with views of nearby stars and nebulae and residential areas where elves lived and worked, and Admiral Talon said that Haven Point was home to over 50,000 people. Jessica asked about the station defenses, and Admiral Talon's face grew somber, and he admitted that defenses were minimal and that the elves had relied on their location and diplomacy to stay safe. But clearly that was no longer enough. He said that the Confederation had dozens of stations like Haven Point, and thousands of civilian ships, and all were vulnerable to species like the Dominion, who respected only force, and that Elven military forces were small and outdated and designed for peacekeeping, not war. Jessica said that Earths had experience building defenses and training military forces, and that humans could help if the elves were willing to learn, and Admiral Talon said the Council would almost certainly accept that offer, because the alternative was to keep retreating until there was nowhere left to go. They returned to the docking area, where the Resolute crew was taking shore leave, and Jessica saw her people mixing with elves and exchanging stories and cultural information, and there was laughter and friendship forming, and she felt proud of how her crew represented humanity. Linda was explaining human weapons technology to a group of fascinated Elven engineers, and Amy was discussing navigation with Elven pilots, and Kate was helping set up better communication protocols between human and Elven systems. Lyra approached and said that her crew was heading home tomorrow, but that she hoped to see Jessica again and maybe work together in the future, and Jessica said she would like that and gave Lyra her contact information. Admiral Talon said that the formal ceremony would be held in 2 days and asked if the Resolute could stay until then, and Jessica checked with Amy, who confirmed that they could remain at Haven Point for a few days without affecting their patrol schedule. Evening, there was a gathering in one of the station's social areas, and humans and elves mingled and shared food and drinking stories, and Jessica found herself talking with various elves about everything from ship design to philosophy to what life was like on Earth. One young elven woman asked if Earth was really as dangerous as the stories said, and Jessica laughed and said it was probably worse, and told her about hurricanes and earthquakes and dangerous animals and diseases, and the elf looked horrified and asked how humans survived. Jessica said that was exactly the point, and that humans had to be tough and adaptable and clever to survive childhood on Earth, and that those traits made them good at handling unexpected situations in the young. Elf said that explained a lot about human behavior. The celebration continued late into the station. Night Cycle and Jessica eventually returned to the Resolute and collapsed into her bunk and fell asleep immediately, and dreamed of stars and ships and the strange paths that had brought humanity to this moment in galactic history. The next morning, Jessica woke to urgent alerts on her communication panel, and for a moment she thought they were under attack, but then she read the messages and realized it was just Earth Command trying to reach her, and apparently news of the battle had caused quite a stir back home. She dressed quickly and went to the bridge, where Amy was already dealing with a flood of incoming transmissions, and Earth Command wanted detailed reports, and several news organizations wanted interviews, and the military brass wanted to know if she had started a war. Jessica took a deep breath and opened the priority channel to Earth Command and Fleet. Admiral Rodriguez appeared on screen, and he did not look happy, but he also did not look angry, and his expression was more concerned than upset. He asked Jessica to explain in her own words what had happened and why she had engaged 6 Dominion ships without authorization, and Jessica gave him the same explanation she had given the Elven Council, and added that she had followed protocol for responding to distress calls. Admiral Rodriguez listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that, officially, he had to remind her that engaging hostile forces without direct orders was against regulations and that there would be an inquiry when she returned home, but unofficially. He said that she had done exactly what any decent human being would do, and that Earth was proud of her and her crew, and that the diplomatic corps was already working with the Elven Confederation on alliance negotiations, and that her actions had opened doors that had been closed for years. He also warned that the Dominion was furious and had filed formal complaints with the Galactic Council and were demanding that Earth's hand over the Resolute crew for trial, and Earth had obviously refused, but tensions were high, and Jessica should be careful. Jessica asked if they should return home immediately, but Admiral Rodriguez said no, and that they should stay for the ceremony and show the galaxy that Earth stood by its actions and its friends, and that running away now would send the wrong message. The transmission ended, and Jessica felt both relieved and nervous because she had not started a war, but she had definitely made the Dominion angry, and that could lead to problems down the road, but she also knew she would make the same choice against Kate. Reported that they were receiving a transmission from an unknown source, and the encryption was sophisticated but not hostile, and Jessica told her to put it through with caution, and the screen filled with a face she did not recognize. The alien was humanoid, but with blue skin and large dark eyes and elaborate tattoos covering its face and neck, and it introduced itself as Ambassador Krell from the Nexus Coalition. Said it represented over 40 species who were concerned about Dominion expansion. Ambassador Krell said that the Coalition had been watching human activities with interest, and that yesterday's battle had impressed many species, and that several Coalition members wanted to open diplomatic relations with Earth and discuss mutual defense agreements. Jessica said she appreciated that, but she was not authorized to negotiate treaties, and Ambassador Krell said he understood but wanted Jessica to know that humanity had made a powerful statement and that other species were watching, and many were hopeful. Transmission ended, and Amy whistled and said that Jessica had apparently become famous across multiple star systems overnight, and Jessica groaned and said she just wanted to do her job and go back to patrolling the frontier. Linda laughed and said it was too late for that, and that Jessica was now the public face of human military intervention and probably would be giving speeches and attending diplomatic functions for years, and Jessica said that sounded awful, though. Rest of the day was spent dealing with administrative tasks and preparing for the ceremony, and Jessica had to write multiple reports and answer questions from Earth Command and deal with requests for interviews, and she was exhausted by evening. Ira came by, the Resolute, that evening and invited Jessica to dinner at one of Haven Point's finest restaurants, and Jessica accepted because she needed a break from paperwork and also because she enjoyed Lyra company. The restaurant was located on an observation deck with stunning views of the stars and nebulae beyond, and the interior was decorated with living plants and flowing water and soft lights that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They sat at a private table and ordered food, and Lyra explained the various elven dishes and their cultural significance, and Jessica tried everything and found most of it surprisingly good, although some flavors were strange to her human palate. Lyra asked about Earth and what it was like growing up on a death world, and Jessica described her childhood in the mountains of Colorado, where bears and mountain lions were real dangers, and winter storms could kill unprepared hikers. She talked about learning to respect nature, while also understanding that nature did not care about you, and that survival meant being prepared and aware, and willing to fight when necessary. And Lyra listened with fascination. Lyra said that elven children grew up in carefully controlled environments where danger was minimized and safety was paramount, and that they learned philosophy and art and science, but not how to defend themselves or survive hostile conditions. She said that elven culture valued peace and beauty and knowledge, but had forgotten that sometimes you needed strength to protect those things, and that watching humans fight had reminded her people of something important. Jessica said that Earth had learned the hard way that peace required strength, and that being able to defend yourself did not make you violent but made others think twice before attacking, and that hopefully the Elven Confederation would learn from human experience. They talked for hours about their respective cultures and histories and values, and Jessica realized that despite their differences, humans and elves, had more in common than she expected, and both species valued family and community and wanted a better future. Eventually, they returned to the station common areas where preparations for tomorrow ceremony were underway, and workers were setting up stages and decorations and testing audio systems, and Jessica was impressed by the scale of the event. Lyra said that the Confederation wanted to make a statement, and that this ceremony would be broadcast across elven space and beyond, and that it was as much about politics as gratitude, and Jessica said she understood the next morning. Jessica and her crew put on their dress uniforms and assembled in the Resolute hangar bay, and then marched together to the ceremony location, and crowds lined the route. And elves waved and cheered, and some held signs thanking humanity. The ceremony was held in a massive amphitheater that could hold thousands of people, and it was already full when they arrived, and Jessica saw elves and other species from across the sector and media recording devices. Everywhere Admiral Talon welcomed everyone, and gave a speech about courage and sacrifice and friendship, and then he called Jessica to the stage and presented her with a medal that was beautiful and ancient and meant more to the elves than she fully understood. Lyra also spoke and described the battle from her perspective and talked about how she had felt when she saw a human ship charging into impossible odds to save strangers, and how it had changed her understanding of what courage meant. Several other speakers followed, and each one talked about the importance of standing up to aggression and protecting the innocent and working together across species lines, and Jessica felt the weight of expectation growing with each speech. Finally, it was Jessica's turn to speak, and she approached the podium and looked out at thousands of faces watching her, and for a moment she felt overwhelmed. But then she thought about her crew and why they had fought. She said that humans did not claim to be heroes, and that they were just people trying to do the right thing, and that the right thing was to help others when they needed it, and that any species worth respecting would do the same. She said that the galaxy was big and dangerous and full of threats like the Dominion, but it was also full of good people who wanted peace and safety and prosperity, and that those good people needed to stand together. She said that Earth was young and small and had limited resources, but would always defend its friends, and would always answer distress calls, and would always fight for those who could not fight for themselves. Amphitheater erupted in applause and cheers, and Jessica felt emotion rising in her throat. But she kept her composure and saluted the crowd and returned to her seat. After the ceremony, there was a reception with food and drinks and networking, and Jessica spent hours shaking hands and answering questions and posing for pictures, and by the end she was completely exhausted. But she also felt satisfaction because she knew that today had been important, and that relationships had been formed and alliances had been strengthened. And the galaxy had changed just a little bit for the better. That evening, the Resolute prepared to depart Haven Point and return to Earth, and the crew was excited to go home after their unexpected adventure. And Jessica was ready to sleep in her own bed and eat familiar food. Lyra came to say goodbye, and she hugged Jessica, which surprised her because elves usually did not engage in physical contact with other species, but Lyra said that Jessica had earned the right to be considered family admiral. Talon also came and presented Jessica with official documents from the High Council requesting formal military cooperation with Earth, and said he hoped to work with her again soon, and Jessica said she looked forward to it. Resolute undocked from Haven Point and turned toward home, and as they accelerated away, Jessica looked back at the beautiful elven station and thought about everything that had happened, and how one decision to answer a distress call had changed so much, a set course for Earth, and said they would arrive in 5 days. And Jessica nodded and settled into her command chair and watched the stars and thought about the future. She knew that Earth was entering a new phase of galactic politics, and that humans would be expected to stand up against threats and protect weaker species and lead by example, and it was a heavy responsibility. But she also knew that humanity was ready, and that they would face whatever came next with courage and determination, and the refusal to abandon those in need. Somewhere out in the galaxy, the Dominion was watching and learning that humans were not to be underestimated, and that attacking human allies was a mistake you only made once.